G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director of the Australia Institute, and welcome to Pole Position, our regular fortnightly catch-up with the Guardian Essential poll, talking to the political editor Katharine Murphy of Guardian Australia, as well as Pete Lewis and John Remington from Essential Media. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. I live here in Ngunnawal country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And just acknowledging that tomorrow is Invasion Day, and obviously sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And there's obviously a lot of unfinished business, particularly in terms of voice, treaty and truth. So welcome back everyone to 2022. It's an election year. I can't believe it's 2022. This happens to me every year. I feel like, oh my God, I'm living in the future. But it's been a mammoth summer. We've obviously seen the Omicron wave hit most of the east coast of Australia and elsewhere, precipitating things like many workers being out sick either with COVID or having to isolate, resulting in supply chain issues and empty shelves in the supermarkets and all kinds of other problems within the workforce. A bit of a shadow lockdown happening in many states where people aren't venturing out. We've obviously seen a massive heat wave over in Western Australia, and many other problems to do with that huge pandemic wave hitting us, and in some cases a lack of preparation, in other cases probably problems that couldn't be avoided. And of course we're heading into an election, looking ahead to an early budget. Kids are back at school next week in most states, I believe. So there's a lot happening. And today, Katharine Murphy has just come straight from listening to Anthony Albanese at the National Press Club. But I do want to welcome you all back. We really appreciate how many of you responded, and it sounds like we're hanging out to hear from us over the summer with so much happening in politics. So we're looking forward to getting into it. But yeah, welcome back. We're looking forward to a really big year this year. And thank you so much for joining us and for supporting Pole Position last year. Katharine, I've given probably just a taste of everything that's been happening over the summer. We always talk about a big fortnight in politics, but in this case, a big kind of month or two. What's your take on how things are at in politics as we kind of head into this election year?
Yeah, well, look, I think the simple version, Eb, is that Scott Morrison would have hoped, I would think, to pick up a little bit of ground over the summer break. Traditionally, when politicians get out of our faces for the summer break, generally there's a little bit of a rebound in their approval ratings because everybody gets an hiatus from conflict and heavy policy and political discussion. So I think the government would have hoped in its heart of hearts that a summer break would be beneficial to the government standing. Those events that you describe, the handling of the Omicron wave and the aftermath, and the experience, I think, of a lot of Australians over this holiday season was perhaps COVID moved from being an abstraction to being a lived reality for a lot of people, a lot of infections, a lot of events disrupted by, people testing positive for COVID in the event they could get a test. So it's sort of it's been a summer of frustration, I think it's fair to say, for a lot of people, and partly I think that frustration has sort of bubbled because towards the end of last week, I think more in hope than anything, the government was setting us up for a more normal Christmas season, and that this would be what Australians deserve. You've all worked really hard at suppression and all of that sort of stuff. And it didn't really pan out that way. So, look, I don't think people are sitting at home with their baseball bats waiting for the government. I think people are very focused on, not what's going to happen in 3 months' time, but what they need to deal with today and tomorrow and next week with sending kids back to school and getting themselves back into office work or to other areas of work. Of course, hospitality workers and others have slaved, over the Christmas period, at risk of being infected themselves. So, it's the sort of end of a summer of frustration. The government would have hoped for better, but I think the thing that to bear in mind as we approach this election year is that it is extremely difficult for Labor to win enough seats to change the government. Arithmetically, the government has a significant stronghold, and let's call that stronghold the state of Queensland and the margins in the state of Queensland. So, it's very difficult to predict how the next few months are going to go. I think, as Scott Morrison's colleagues say, he's lost a lot of bark. The Prime Minister has lost a lot of bark. People are frustrated. People are having another look at him. The data this fortnight shows that people are, people are downgrading their approval of the Commonwealth's pandemic response. It's difficult and choppy, but but it's also very difficult to change the government given the election result in 2019. So, I mean, that's the situation report as I see it as of this second.
Yeah. Pete, the Guardian Essential poll out today does show that little bit of bark stripped off the PM, as Katharine has said, but is it stripped off in the right places, as we were talking about? That's a national figure. Drilling down into those numbers, does it look different in different states?
It does. Do we want to go into the numbers straight away? Because I've been given the very important job of driving the PowerPoint today. I'm feeling a little bit, what could go wrong? Let's see. We're about to find out, folks. That's the music. And here we go. Are we seeing that okay, team?
Yes.
Yes, good.
It's the Guardian though, not your slides.
Oh, shivers. That's actually the piece I wrote, which is an absolute torture of a metaphor around the summer of tennis, if people want to read it. But I will go back in and try to do it properly.
I jinxed you, Pete. I apologise.
I know.
I apologise. There we are.
That's pole biz. Look, it's more than bark. I reckon he's bleeding. If you combine the numbers, so, this is the benchmark that John and the team have been putting together. Each and every poll since the beginning of the pandemic in March, we're at the lowest level of positive ratings for the performance. I think, John, we haven't put the number on the first slide, but I think it's in the low 30s combined. At its height, that was in the 70s. The sense that the government has managed this well has really been blown away. In my Guardian piece, which people can see if I've missed any metaphor about the tennis, I do make the point that I think that what's happened over summer is much more, people are no longer watching politics. Politics is affecting them. And I guess it has right through the pandemic. But when you are promised a summer of freedom, but instead you get a summer of queues, confusion and fear, you are going to actually see what happens when a government doesn't deliver. And I think the numbers that we'll go through today paint that picture up a little bit. State by state, the performance of the federal government is on the slide everywhere, to Katharine's point, down to 37 in Queensland. Nowhere above 40, and look where it was at its height in all those states above the 50% mark, although some time ago now. State governments have also taken a hit, apart from the Victorian government, which is still sort of, well, WA is even down to 66, but the big drop there is New South Wales, which was, my home state and the state of freedom, has had the big dip from mid 50s down to 37 over the summer. So what does that say? It says that the consensus that the governments had been doing a pretty good job through COVID was at an end. I think that the summer strategy, Katharine's totally right. I've always said that, summer's for incumbents and winter is for oppositions, because that's when people start getting grumpy. The summer was meant to be the easy time when people would move on to 2022, a brand new year. We're still stuck in COVID. Schools go back. We don't know how that's going to be managed. We do know there's still going to be pinches on both boosters and rats. We don't quite know what's going to happen to workforce issues, both across the health and education system. We don't know what's going to be happening around logistics and education. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, but no longer is the government approaching what are going to be a series of challenges from a position of strength. It's now doing so from a position of weakness. So again, just on Katharine's opening salvo, totally right that seat by seat, it's a difficult path to a narrow victory, but it also starts to smell a bit like a wave as you start looking at these numbers. A very wise person made the point to me over summer that a Labor government has not won power since the beginning or since World War II in a narrow election. They've always been waves. So, maybe it's, a big win or bust for Labor, but, that's all ahead of us.
Shall we move on to the next slides, Pete?
Sure, you tell me what to do.
Can I just do one? Could I just, sorry,
Yeah.
just make one very quick point about New South Wales and the coming off of the people's approval of the state strategy in New South Wales. Obviously, a Liberal government. Also, I mentioned Queensland is the stronghold. Queensland is the electoral buffer. But a lot of the government's strategy for the election has focused on winning seats in New South Wales. That's been very important to the government being successful in a fourth term, hopefully in a majority setting. And so I think it's very difficult for Scott Morrison to have both his own, thumbs down about the federal government's performance, and also a quite steep thumbs down about the local Liberal government's management of the pandemic as well. Talking about challenges for the Prime Minister, that's just one to have in the back of your mind. That's one to focus on. Anyway, not to delay things.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, talking about waiting with bats earlier. I'm not sure if there's anyone waiting with cricket bats for the PM, but certainly I think in New South Wales, judging from my own, many of whom lean Liberal family, there's some white hot anger with Dominic Perrottet out there in a few places, but whether or not that translates federally, I guess we'll see.
Well, just the one last thing on New South Wales, they're struggling to fill candidates because they can't control their internal factions, aren't they, Katharine? Like, it's a bit messy.
The New South Wales Libs. Yeah, look, I think there was a deal done at a meeting of the state executive last weekend to pre-select various Liberal candidates in the seats, in the remaining seats. So the factions are trying to put together a deal that will allow Liberal candidates to be pre-selected, but it's not really clear yet whether that peace deal will hold, because the Liberals in New South Wales are particularly balkanised in terms of factions. There's many factions and sub-factions. So it's New South Wales pre-selections are sort of moving towards an end point, but it could all blow as well. That's the latest.
Thanks,
All right.
Katharine.
Shall we kick on?
Yeah, let's move on to the next one. I can see we've got just over 900 people on the line with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're just going through the latest essential poll results for The Guardian today. So dip in approval for Morrison, Pete. Okay.
Well, to go back to my tennis metaphors, this is the first time he has not had a net advantage with his approval. 46, 46, that's love all. Net zero. Now, I'm still surprised 46 approved the performance personally, but this is the view from the stands. The other things that have moved along is for Albo again, net zero, 39, 39, 23 undecided. So that is not to say that people have neutral views about either of these candidates. 23% undecided still is obviously the untilled ground for Albanese. On preferred Prime Minister, Morrison is still ahead, 42-34. But again, that is the narrowest margin, I believe, John, since we've started asking that in this cycle. So it's rare that opposition leaders are ahead as preferred Prime Minister, but he's getting within QE now. It's down to 8-point split. Should we come up for air or just run through the slides today? You're the boss, Ebony.
Yeah, no, let's come up for a bit of air. We've just heard, well, not everyone may have heard, it was on ABC 24, but Anthony Albanese at the press club. We're focused a lot, I guess, over the summer on what Scott Morrison has been doing as Prime Minister and what the federal government has or hasn't been doing in terms of not securing free rats and then making them available to concession holders, but leaving that up to pharmacies to source, and a few other of those things that might have contributed to that dip in approval. But can you just tell us a little bit, having come straight from the press club, Katharine, about the pitch that Anthony Albanese is making to the people of Australia?
Yeah, well, look, over the summer, Eb, the sort of background or the preamble to the press club is that Anthony Albanese's been campaigning flat out, basically, over the summer, with trips to Queensland and northern Tasmania and all the places one would expect. He had a brief holiday, but not, I think it was only really a couple of days in the final week before Christmas, and then has basically hit the hustings since. In terms of the pitch at the press club, well, politics tragics will know that the National Press Club, there's a tradition of a scene setter at the National Press Club in January. Generally, the leaders show up and deliver one. There's more attention paid to the scene setters in election years because, in a way, they're seen as the unofficial start of the election campaign proper, and that was certainly the mode Anthony Albanese was in today. I think the speech, look, we saw a very confident Anthony Albanese. He was very relaxed. He's done a lot of work on his presentation. There's been a whole lot of work basically behind the scenes to make the Labor leader look more prime ministerial and project in prime ministerial fashion. Whether or not you think he's doing that or not is very much in the eye of the beholder. In terms of the content, I think the speech was interesting in this sense. At the moment, I think I flagged this a second ago, Eb, I think people in politics tell me that right at the moment, people are not really focused on the future because there is too much to deal with in the here and now. And in a way, planning too much for the future is a waste of emotional and practical energy because events disrupt things. A lot of people planned Christmas celebrations involving extended families that hit the fence, for example. People planned holidays that hit the fence. People are very much, I'm told by people who follow these things, voters are very much in the here and now, which makes sense. So what was Anthony Albanese's main initiative of today? Well, it was an initiative timed with the return to school. It was a focus on improving ventilation in classrooms and improving other sort of COVID-safe infrastructure in classrooms and mental health resources for kids. So that suggests to me that Anthony Albanese is aware that the campaign will be about the moment, but you've got to use the moment to try and present a picture of the future, if that makes sense. You've got to use the moment, the zeitgeist concern of the moment in order to paint a picture of the weaknesses of your opponent and also your values and objectives as alternate Prime Minister. So in a way, it was sort of quite a small initiative, really, to kick off the election year. But I think if you look a little deeper, I think it shows, it tells you a lot about where the voters are up to right now, and tells you a little bit about the challenges that Albanese is going to have in making his change case. If people are very future focused, they're more attentive to a change case, right? If they're head down, bum up on what they're dealing with now, then you've got to think a bit more creatively about how you present your change case through the prism of the challenges of the here and now. So that was what I found most interesting about it.
Yeah. Pete, do you want to head back to the slides now and we'll do the next one?
Let me see if I can re-enter. Yay. So this is to my point about lived experience. we put a number of things that happened to many people that are watching this webinar over the summer.
That's not in full screen. If you could make that.
Oh my God. Okay, back out again. Let's re-enter.
Sorry.
God.
Just hard for people to see.
I know, this is why I'm never given these tools.
There we go.
Yeah.
But then it will get even better, right? So personally had COVID, close member or friend had COVID, required to isolate as a close contact, visited a test centre to receive a PCR test, have been unable to buy or obtain a rapid antigen test. And that one's quite a big number. But I thought the most interesting number here was a majority of people, some form of disruption happened to them over the summer. Now, part of that is because we had a particularly virulent strain of the Omicron, of the COVID virus, but I think it also says that people were affected in a way that they probably didn't expect over a summer that had been promised as a summer of freedom. But this is where it gets interesting, and also where the print gets quite small. I apologise. We asked people whether the impact of the handling of COVID would make them more or less likely to vote for the coalition. And as you can see on a bunch of these, including the Djokovic cluster, 23% Djokovic makes them less likely, reduced border restrictions between states and territory, 22%, shortage of rapid antigen, 38%, increased COVID cases over the past month, 30%, and then 37 Morrison's performance as Prime Minister. I just read bottom of the top, sorry folks. But underneath that, where I might call John in because we don't have the deepest slide, amongst Liberal voters, you had up to 1 in 5 Liberal voters saying they're now less likely to vote for Morrison. Now, you can discount some of the Labor voters, they're just going to say they're never going to vote, so of course they're less likely. But it feels to me that lived experience is leading to consequences which might explain some of the impact on polls, and makes you think that, you know, this could end up being a referendum just on Morrison's handling of COVID, the way it's going, if he can't reset it pretty quickly.
Yeah, so there's a lot more detail that we've put on our website if people want to check that out. But really the thing we've been looking at here is that net change, that difference between the voters that have been put off by what's been happening and the voters that have been drawn to them. So if you see it, Pete did say, call out small print, but Djokovic is the only one there where there's been a net gain to the coalition because of their handling of Djokovic at 4%.
Although I might say with Djokovic, John, that amongst other voters, which is your Palmers, your One Nations, that was actually up in the high 30s. So his handling of that one actually alienated one group he's trying to keep within the family.
Yeah, that's very true. So yeah, his handling of Prime Minister, we have Liberal voters who generally see that as a positive thing. But in terms of the rapid antigen tests, particularly, that amongst coalition voters, 21% have said the handling of that has turned them off or made them less likely to vote for Liberals the next election, with fewer voting towards. So that could be one of those issues which are really affecting, as Peter and Katharine said, a lived experience and threatening the coalition vote at the next election.
Pete, do you want to take us to the next slide?
Yeah, government priorities for the upcoming year. Every year we give a list of issues and track it year to year. I think the interesting thing here is the movement. Last year, job growth was a top 3 issue, with the unemployment levels low. That is less so. What's moved up? Action on climate change, up from 28 to 36 as a top 3 issue. Public systems up, reduced financial debt, deficit in budget up a bit, but not a top issue. Household bills hasn't shifted, even though there's lots of talk of inflation. I don't know if anything else. The climate one probably sticks out to me as quite interesting there, Katharine.
Yeah, do you want to come out of the slides again and we'll go back to a bit of a chat?
I reckon.
Thank you. Sorry, before we go to Katharine on climate, I was just going to, I guess, comment on that that being a real sticking point for Scott Morrison, that idea that he really rejected that idea of providing free rat tests, and that people definitely kind of see that as his responsibility, it looks like, from those polling results, and how much that will come back to bite him. I will just take a very quick moment to plug our chief economist, Richard Dennis, has a new book coming out called Big, the Role of the State in the Modern Economy, that I think speaks to some of those issues where over the past 2 years, we have seen a much bigger role for the government in the economy due to the pandemic, but that also highlighting that people do value those public services that government provides. And I guess this has really shown exactly how much government is involved in our everyday lives, and whether or not that's going to be that idea that Morrison was running out before Christmas, that it was time for government to get out. I'm not sure how much that will resonate, but we've got a pre-order offer available for anyone who wants to buy Richard Dennis's new book. It's called Big. You can get 20% off, and I'll put this in the chat for anyone who is interested. But Katharine, before we get on to climate, how much do you think that pre-Christmas kind of manoeuvring for the Prime Minister kind of came back to bite him pretty quickly?
Well, we've talked about this a bit last year in these sessions. It was sort of a curious spectacle to see the Prime Minister, in essence, campaigning against his own record during the pandemic. The Prime Minister was Mr. Government during the pandemic, looking for structures basically to run a very assertive public health strategy, and for good reason. We saved a number of lives and livelihoods as because of those strategies that were rolled out by the Commonwealth and the states. Then, because the Prime Minister started to lose the base, we saw him revert to more conventional Liberal Party messaging, which is capitalism saves everything, government needs to get out of your face. We saw that, which was sort of exemplified in a speech that he gave at the Sydney Institute just before Christmas. Morrison periodically gives some interesting speeches, and that was one of them, because he was basically telling business leaders his own thinking about the sort of linchpins of the election contest next year. Now, if we look at that speech, what it tells us is the Prime Minister thinks that 2022 could be a rerun of 2019. Basically when Labor sought power in 2019 under Bill Shorten, there was an extensive program of change for government. It was a very assertive program of government. Labor thought it was in a social democratic moment. It discovered it wasn't. Morrison thought they were wrong all along, thought that was not where the public was at. And in the end, the Prime Minister was right. The Prime Minister made the correct judgment about where the public was at, and he weaponised the program against Labor in the campaign. Now, the Prime Minister thinks that 2022, if we take that Sydney Institute speech, which I'd encourage you to go and look at, it's online, he thinks that the looming contest will be similar again, that Labor will basically, because of the pandemic, which has prompted a whole discussion about the role of government, whether government should be more active, more powerful, be an institution that changes lives as well as opportunity, right? Because there's been a whole discussion around the pandemic. Morrison clearly thinks that Anthony Albanese will run a reboot of the social democratic moment campaign, where he focuses on education, he focuses on health funding, he focuses on government as a change agent. So, look, Anthony Albanese clearly is not a carbon copy of the Shorten program. Albanese has jettisoned some of the most controversial elements of that program and has spent much of the last 3 years dancing between the raindrops in terms of telling people what sort of Prime Minister he will be. He's been very recessed. But as Labor starts to make its change case, which is what we've been seeing over the last few months, Albanese is certainly leaning into this idea that government is a change agent, that he will be a Labor Prime Minister where government plays a significant role, including in making economies more productive, in improving lives and circumstances for people. and the Prime Minister thinks that's the wrong call, that's not where Australians are at. Now, one of these two men is going to be right, and we're going to find out which of the two is correct in a few months' time. So, but that's one of the most important sort of backdrop dynamics of the election conversation, for want of a better word.
Katharine, can I just ask you one question? The problem with that approach from Morrison is the one thing he did achieve, which was the sense that he managed the first phase of the pandemic at least well. He can no longer own that.
Yeah.
If he walks away from that, he's actually getting rid of anything he's done over the last couple of years.
Well, it's government in my mind. It's sort of like the Prime Minister of Scott Morrison is like looking at phases of the moon, right? We had a phase of the Scott Morrison Prime Ministership where I think he genuinely thought about himself as a big tent leader.
Yeah.
Where being a Prime Minister was more about 50% plus one, that you could actually bring groups of people together and govern from the centre through the sort of crossover political dynamics that we saw in the first wave of the pandemic. Like I said, I think then the base started to disconnect. That has pushed Morrison back into a sort of more conventional liberal leader posture. You're quite right, Pete, that the difficulty that is that Morrison then campaigns against his own record, which is for you and me totally bizarre. Like, what the hell is that, right? But for voters who are more disengaged, who knows? But like long-winded answer, which means that Morrison, in terms of, he's gone back into full campaign director mode now. He's thinking about how to get 50% plus one. If you can get plus 2 or 3 or 4, great. But this guy will govern with 50% plus one. You only need to basically narrow cast your way to victory. And he's been in that mode for some months, based on a judgment that votes are going to peel off to the right-wing insurgents and not necessarily flow back to the government. So, if you're looking for big tent politics over the next little bit, maybe, I don't know, watch something on Netflix, because I don't think it's going to happen.
I would like to go next to questions from the audience, and I'm a bit out of practice because I forgot to remind everyone, if you've got questions for our panel, you can type those into the Q&A function. There's a box there and you should be able to put in your question. You can also upvote other people's questions or leave comments on them. I can see we've got close to 940 people on the line with us. Thank you again for joining us. Going into the questions now. The first one is from James Bolster. He says, Essential and Guardian team, we've seen a lot of variation in the Independent and United Australia Party vote across different polls. What does Essential find with regard to support for independence and for Palmer? Pete, can I throw to you on that one?
Yeah, I'm going to throw to John, though, because he's got the numbers in front of him.
And I've forgotten, in truth. What's the latest data? I don't know. John will know.
So we lost, as regular viewers will know, and people talk about it in a bit more detail, we're refraining from, particularly at the minute, releasing polling on a regular basis. He talked about the horse race and ultimately the
wicked horse race
of what is happening right now and how that'll transpose and evolve over the next few months. What we've tended to do is more release it on a quarterly basis at least. So the last polling stuff we did was in December with the launch of the new website. So you can look at our website, which was in the chat. I think we'll put it back up and see all the latest polling. What we did see in December was initially Palmer started his big campaign, I think it was in September last year, with another run in November, December, and then it seems to have really ramped up again this month. So whilst it's still very small, it moved from perhaps 1 or 2% to 3 and 4% overall. So still pretty minor, but in terms of absolute values, that's almost 100% increase in some areas. We've also got a demographic breakdown on the website, so you can see in which areas that is landing. And again, particularly for Palmer, it was amongst younger males where we're seeing a bigger increase, and also in New South Wales. So certainly check that out. The next update on the voting, I think, Pete, will probably be next month, perhaps early March.
Yeah.
And obviously, on the run up to any election, we'll be looking to have a bit more immediate access to that data.
Yeah, we might break out once the horse race is on. We might break out no horse race strategy. Can I also say that on the Palmer thing, last time it almost became part of the engine just to keep Labor out of power. They're running a different set of messages this time, which is a pox on all your houses. And I think the Liberals are concerned that those votes may not come back to them again, and just noting that the Djokovic thing played worse amongst people that are being attracted to those parties. I think I'm not sure how Machiavellian Palmer is. I'm not quite sure how he can pivot this into being an anti-Albanese campaign. But at this stage, it seems to be taking more away from the Liberals and the Nationals than it is from Labor.
Yeah, Katharine, I've got a follow-up question here from Michael Bradley, who says, will Clive Palmer just help the coalition to stay in power again? But Pete's making a good point there. Last time, Clive Palmer's message was just purely anti-Shorten almost, whereas this time it's much more focused on, get the government out of your life type of a message, and a pox on all your houses.
Last time there was a bit of a curve in the messaging. I mean, obviously, I don't think that there was a phase of where Palmer was positive about Labor. I don't think that happened, but the messaging sort of started generally as pox on most of your houses, and then crystallised, particularly in the final 2 weeks of the election campaign, to be very anti-Labor and very particularly anti-Bill Shorten. And those ad buys that the Palmer United Party had in the last election campaign were astronomical. Basically, they kind of wiped other actors off the map in terms of campaign advertising. So Michael's question is, well, are they basically going to be a super PAC for the Liberal and Nationals again, which is sort of how they operated in 2019? Well, look, as Pete says, current indications is no, because the message is much more stridently pox on all your houses. Also, though, I just think these things can change. It's possible that they will just genuinely sit it out and just say, screw all the incumbents, try and get people, and try and get actual candidates up this time. Last time, it didn't really seem to be the objective to get candidates up. This time, they might want to get candidates up, in which case they need to focus more on promoting themselves and saying everyone else is terrible. So, yeah, look, too early to know. And look, the most accurate barometer of what do we think about that is the government's behaviour, and the government's behaviour for at least the last sort of 5 or so months suggests, certainly to me, that they are very concerned that votes will peel off to Palmer and other insurgencies and not necessarily come back to the coalition in preference flows. So the government is certainly not confident that Palmer is a force that's helpful to them in this contest, but I stress, early days.
The other curveball is One Nation. So last election, they preferenced against Labor. In 2016, they preferenced against incumbents. If they go back to preferencing against incumbents, a lot of those problems Labor had in Queensland are not as obvious.
As a follow-up, well, not a follow-up, but I guess a related question, I've got one here from Jonathan Nolan, who's writing from Wentworth, and their question is, can the independents cause enough upsets to counter the strength of the government in Queensland? Take that one.
Well, at the moment, we've got to have a look at it. Our polling lumps the independents in with UAP and One Nation. So we've got to think about how we actually pick those up. I think it's hard to make predictions or prognosis on individual seats when you're running a national sample of 1,000. And I don't, there are robo polls that are suggesting that there are seats in play. What I think is true is that it will divert attention away from what the government would like their key message to be, which is effectively to attack Labor from the right, saying that they're irresponsible on climate and that they're going to sort of sell, just be a disaster of a government. And they've got this new cohort, which is, the blue-green Liberal voters who had never quite crossed the threshold to be Green voters, who want to see a Liberal government doing more on climate and doing more on gender and doing more on integrity. So it's a disruption to a simple re-election strategy. It will divert attention, it will divert money, and it will also influence the policy. And so because of that, whether or not the seats are picked up, it is a serious factor in how the election finally plays.
Yeah, Katharine, this might take us back to climate change, actually, because a lot of the independents who are running in safe Liberal seats, obviously that's a very tough ask to win a safe Liberal seat, and people who have done it in the past, like Cathy McGowan and then Helen Haynes to follow, and Zali Steggall, were often running against someone who had been in for a while and was seen to be out of touch with their electorate. This is kind of broader than that, saying that the Liberal Party generally is out of touch with people in these electorates, particularly around the issue of climate change and to a lesser extent integrity and those types of issues. But yeah, they at the end of the day still are safe Liberal seats. What's your view on how much they'll disrupt this election?
Well, look, I don't think it's a multi-seat phenomenon. I don't think that, that a bunch of seats will fall. I think you'd have to look very closely at Wentworth, because obviously Karen Phelps almost won that seat, in the last time she contested it. So there's clearly a really a strong potential protest vote in Wentworth. And Allegra Spender is obviously a highly credible candidate based on all the information to date. So certainly I think the Liberals are worried about Wentworth. The Prime Minister was worried enough about Zali Steggall being re-elected to try and court the former New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian, clearly against Berejiklian's wishes towards the end of last year, because, they would ideally love Warringah to return to the Liberal Party. So look, I think it is it's a handful of seats phenomenon rather than, I don't think we're witnessing, I'm sorry if I've used this comparison before here, I don't think we're witnessing some sort of Macron style on march uprising here. I think it is, these are small seat by seat propositions. But again, I think it's not necessarily a one electoral cycle problem for the Liberal Party, and partly why Morrison signed up to net zero was in recognition that structurally the Liberal Party has a problem in metropolitan Australia if it doesn't get serious about climate action. So Morrison judges that over the next bunch of election cycles, this is a problem. So he's already tried to neutralise the problem. So that suggests it's serious, but whether or not, Rome is built in a day in terms of an independence movement, well, we're gonna have to wait and see on that.
Yeah. Where are we? Questions? No, that's answered. Another couple of questions in here around the prospect of a half Senate election in May and a general election in September. I believe that was floated by potentially Nikki Sava, I feel like, earlier in the week on Radio National. Do we have any thoughts on prospects of that? Certainly it seems like a March election is not on the cards, but what do we think about that?
Oh my God! Well, as much as I love Nick, I would say, dear God, no, in the strongest possible terms. Look, anything's possible. It's an option. It's possible, but it looks to me like they're gearing up to deliver a budget and then gearing up to go to an election.
Yeah,
I don't know if I have a different view.
For my own sanity, I hope that's.
Dear God, no. Yes.
Although that would be very interesting in Senate terms. A half Senate election would obviously put a huge focus on the Senate and the role of balance of power. There's a much greater role for minor parties and independents in the Senate. So, on the one hand, that'd be really interesting. Certainly, I think would make for an incredibly interesting result in the Senate. And people often vote strategically in the Senate as well. So maybe I do wish for a half Senate election, even though it would upend life in all sorts of ways. The next question that I've got here is really about Fiona Brooke has mentioned here that she is interested in the way the government has changed how it speaks about Western Australia, and there's been an obvious softening of the way they refer to Mark McGowan. How bad is the polling in WA? John, I don't know if you want to tell us about WA quickly, but overall, I guess, Katharine, if I can come back to you, has there been a softening, and does it vary from state to state there?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister, in very general terms, I'll make this point very generally, I think he's sort of really trying to tiptoe away from the pandemic a bit and say, oh, that's the states. Yep, that's the states doing all that stuff. Like from the initial phase of the pandemic where he ran into the centre of management, now he's kind of tiptoeing slightly away from the management, right? So that's just a general observation. In terms of WA, well, Barnaby Joyce had a real crack at Mark McGowan this week. I think on Radio National, he had a real sort of full kind of punch in the chops type observation about Mark McGowan. I can't remember the specifics, which stuck in my mind because that's not the general tone of the federal government towards the WA government or events in WA, because there are 3 seats said to be in play in Western Australia, and the Liberals' vote is depressed because, courtesy of COVID, WA has been a hermit kingdom and a one-party.
Have they got 2 or 3 in their state MPs now? Like it's one hand, isn't it?
Yeah,
they got totally wiped out.
Yeah, no, it's a one-party state. I'm not saying that in some glib fashion. It basically is. But then, look, again. Question we've seen in the polling, I mean, John can do the numbers far more adroitly than me, but we've seen a drop off in local support for McGowan's handling of the pandemic. He's gone from 99.8 to 66%, a number that Scott Morrison had killed for, but nonetheless he's come off the height. What does the entry of COVID into WA mean for the politics over there? Again, there's lots of variables, really. I don't think people should think about WA as being a lock for Labor because everybody loves Mark McGowan. I think we're in a situation where things are fluid and dynamic. And so maybe Labor picks up seats in WA, maybe it doesn't. Well, only time will tell, as they say in the classics.
The one thing I will say before you go to the numbers is that when we've been looking in WA at the tail end of last year, the sense that which Morrison was attacking McGowan, and that was really registering as a proxy for eastern states attacking WA. He became the symbol for everything people in WA hate about the East Coast. And the question in those minds, and a lot of these are Liberal voters who are now McGowan Liberals, and their question was who will back Mark McGowan. So I suspect the Libs did pick up that in their focus group work as well, and that's why you have had a softening. But John,
yeah, and that's exactly right. It's I would like to show you this chart, but it's on our website. Check it out. Mid to 2021, you'd have put your house on Labor. We look at 3 waves together, as people have been chatting about sample sizes, so we wanted a robust sample size. But the 2PP for Labor at the end of June was 61%, so they were miles ahead. What we've seen since then, though, is the coalition really coming back and the drop off from Labor. In the most recent one we've got published, it's 51 Labour, 45 coalition with what's that going to be 6%, 8% undecided. So it's a lot closer than it was in 2021. And as Katharine and Pete said, what's happened recently in Western Australia with extensions to lockdowns and etc. is going to be fascinating to see how that affects it over the next few weeks.
The next question, Katharine, is from Mel Smith. It asks, what does Katharine think of the awkward picture with Grace Tame today and our Prime Minister? Is that body language reflective of the millennial vote this year? But I guess I want to pivot that into what last year was described as Scott Morrison and the government's women problem. Where are we at with that as we enter 2022?
Well, that's both interesting questions. And look, to be clear, because I was doing other things, I was not physically present at the lodge, so I've just seen the vision, like everybody else. That cut of the vision that's been circulating on social media, where where Grace Tame is basically assassinating the Prime Minister with her eyes. So look, it's quite a moment, and I guarantee it'll get a lot of outing on television tonight. It's quite a moment. It's very stark. And Grace Tame's feelings, obviously, about the Prime Minister are very much there to the fore. Look, social media, is not necessarily massively representative, but I've just sort of in between rushing to various things today, I've sort of been watching some of the conversation on social. There's been an interesting spectrum of responses. I think there are a lot of millennials for whom Grace Tame is a really important figure, and not only millennials, women who are just pathetically grateful that this young woman was given a platform as Australian of the Year and she did not waste it.
Yeah.
I think she's a very she's a very popular cultural figure for people who want the dynamics of culture and society to change. So it's quite polarizing. Obviously, people who love Grace Tame will say Grace Tame is my spirit animal. People who think mouthy women ought to be polite when they're with the Prime Minister and smile nicely and observe conventions will think she's a rude young thing. And how dare she sort of offend the etiquette in that moment. So look, blather from me, apologies, but what I'm trying to say is it's one of those moments that'll be quite polarizing, and even some people who are supportive of Grace Tame will be a bit uncomfortable with the spectre of somebody not observing etiquette, because in Australia we like rules, even though we think we're badasses and outlaws. We really quite like rules, and sometimes we're a bit flummoxed when the rules get broken. So yeah, I think it'll play in a few different ways. But I think if I'm speaking personally, watching Grace Tame's advocacy through the year, I mean, she's done a sensational job of getting a really important issue on the national agenda. And for people who might be surprised that Grace Tame went to the lodge and created a very clear sense in her body language that she wasn't particularly enamoured of the Prime Minister she was standing with. But people who are surprised by that, I don't know why you would be, because Grace Tame's whole disposition throughout this last year, was that she's not interested in being co-opted by power, by institutions, by media outlets. She is her own person with her own agenda, and she doesn't feel it necessary to tug the forelock. Now, for a woman of my generation, I just think that's great, because we have been socialised for a long period of time to be polite in the polite moments, and to see a young woman who isn't very polite in the polite moments, fills me with a certain amount of joy. But I don't. But look, I think it will be divisive. I think even people who would normally think Grace Tame's, go you good thing, will be worried about the breach of etiquette. That's my gut feeling.
And we've certainly seen that a lot in politics in the past. Makes me think of when Senator Bob Brown, the leader of the Greens, stood up to protest during George Bush's speech, and many people were kind of very anti-George Bush and anti-Iraq war and agreed with a lot of kind of what he was talking about, but very much objected to standing up in Parliament while a foreign president was speaking. So I think there's a lot to that analysis, Katharine. Yeah,
we're very informal as people. We're not, we don't stand on ceremony. I don't mean that we're informal. If you compare us to Brits or Europeans, we have no manners at all. but we do like rules and conventions, and so anyway, it'd be interesting to see how this plays out over the next week.
Pete, did you want to add anything to that?
I've just had a look at the photos now on the Guardian website. They're awesome. Just have a look, people. They're great.
They do speak 1,000 words.
No, I can't take that analysis any further.
Thank you very much. We've only got a couple of minutes to go. So, Katharine, I just wondered, I won't go for another question, but just thinking specifically of the next couple of weeks in the lead up to the budget, what kinds of things are you expecting to see? Obviously, we're going to see Scott Morrison at the press club next week. Is there anything, other set pieces that people, I guess, should be aware of coming up?
Yeah, well, look, I think certainly the government has been trying as much as possible, consistent with governing, to be campaigning over the summer. The Prime Minister's been more constrained, obviously, by rolling national cabinet deliberations. But if you look at senior ministers, you'll see that they have been out and about as far as possible campaigning. Eb's right, the Prime Minister will address the National Press Club on Monday. And then we will roll into the parliamentary sitting as scheduled, unless the Prime Minister astonishes us by racing to the polls early. We expect to roll into the sitting week as scheduled in February. Then it's a big exercise for a government to deliver a budget. Obviously, we'll be in a faux campaign, well and truly. Everybody will be out full tilt, but the government will also be tied down preparing a budget. It's a big institutional exercise to pull together the economic statement and all the measures. So, it'll be interesting to see how they balance those imperatives, I think. I mean, obviously, it's an election budget. We're not setting up decades of reform here. We're trying to, get re-elected. So, but that's, as on known knowns at the moment, that's what we expect. Prime Minister at the Press Club next week, resumption of Parliament shortly, rolling into a budget in May.
And the real risk, isn't it, that if there is a sense that they're not on path to victory, they will just run a budget with no intention of governing, just for political, which could be really salting the fields if there is a change of government down the track. I would imagine they're going to throw around some form of tax cut just to push that narrative back at Labor as well.
Mm-hmm. Could be. One thing I will say to watch out for is cuts to the ABC budget. It's the end of their triennial funding, and the government has already cut their budget. So keep an eye out on that one. Another reminder that Richard Dennis's book is available for pre-sale. You can head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find out the details for that. But if you pre-order, don't forget to use that code OzInstitute20 to get 20% off. Thank you so much for joining us for the first pole position of the year. I'm looking forward to a very interesting year ahead with you three. Thanks again for joining us, Katharine, Pete, and John. And welcome back, everyone, to 2022. I hope it wasn't a rough summer for you. I hope all your loved ones have been safe from COVID over the summer, and that your rat tests have been abundant and available. And I hope that you got a good break, because strap in for 2022, my friends. I think it's going to be a very big one. And don't forget to check out the Australia Institute's summer series of our podcast, Follow the Money, where we bring you some of the best conversations from our webinar series in 2021. You can find all of those details up on our website at australiainstitute.org.au. And don't forget to head on over to Guardian Australia for all the latest analysis of the Guardian Essential Poll that we've been discussing today, and also for Pete's excellent opinion piece where he has apparently tortured all the tennis metaphors to death, just about. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for joining us again, and we'll see you in a fortnight. Bye-bye.